Okay, we good? Recording? We're happy? You happy?
Yep.
I'm fairly happy.
I'm reasonably.
Reasonably happy. I'm ever so slightly sleep deprived, but that's all fine. Cool beans. I'm going to start filming then, yeah?
Fine job.
Filming? Filming? Cool. Awesome. Welcome to Crimson Guitars. Welcome to Patreon Q&A. I'm filming this on the 14th. I've been away for a little while. I have 3 children. One of them is always ill, and unfortunately I was infected, and I literally wasn't able to stand up for far too long, and haven't been in. So there's been a dearth of videos. I do apologize for that. But I'm back and I'm healthy, and today I'm actually going to be filming this Q&A, and one of the questions was good enough that I'm going to do a separate video just for Patreon by way of an apology for missing one last week, and that is going to be on how to set up a new workshop or a small workshop for guitar building, and we'll go from there. But in this Q&A I'm going to be talking about wood seasoning, material sourcing, using a belt sander as a jointer, and how to set up a plane to stop clogging, or reasons why your plane could be clogging, as well as I think several others that I forgot to summarize because I got interrupted, as is always the case, and all of this in under 20 minutes. So here we go. Question from A1 Bass. Ha! See, the first question is one that I haven't put in summary. He says, I've just listened to your bass demo and have a question. How much of that tone and sustain is down to the house wound pickups, and how much is due to the construction and design? If you kept everything else exactly the same and had made 2 more basses, up to this point you haven't mentioned tone wood. One out of Wenge and one out of Pine, how much different would they sound? So you've couched your question in a question about pickups and construction, but actually it's down to tone wood. They would sound different. There is Wenge and Pine are perfect exemplars. My gosh, how round was that word? They are perfect exemplars of, and that sounds weird because I'm trying not to say exemplars, of everything that I keep on saying about wood and tone wood as with regards to the sound of a guitar, and specifically the sustain of a guitar. You have softer woods and you have harder woods. Wenge is mightily hard for the most part. The bulk of it is this really hard grain that goes throughout, and it is very ringy, very bright, very sustainy. Whereas Pine, I would never suggest anybody ever make a Pine guitar. It might sound okay actually. It might be, it's a fairly soft wood. It doesn't have the sustain. It could and probably will be very thuddy and very, very, very warm in comparison to a middle of the range, say, lightweight mahogany or any Meranti, for example, a lighter Meranti, stuff like that. However, the beginning of the question was how much of the tone and sustain is down to the house wound pickups. A lot of it. The pickups and the electronics, I think, really do make up a large percentage of what you get. We've been experimenting with the pickups at Crimson for a long time now. First with Luigi, and now Sam has come in, and we've had lots of different people come in and test them and talk about things that they do and things they don't do, etc. And the smallest change does make a very, very big difference in the sound and in the sustain. And we're talking about, Sam was talking about things that I personally cannot hear, which is problematic for me. But yeah, anyway, so yes, that would make a difference. It wouldn't be, those are 2 extremes, very hard and very soft. So you definitely would hear a difference. more in the sustain, I think, than in tone necessarily. There would be a slowness in response as well for using pine, but the main reason for avoiding pine is because it's just a horrible, horrible wood to work with. It dents and scratches so easily. You just will never get a good finish on it, period. Moving swiftly onwards, because that's taken up a full 25% of the remaining time that I have on this, well, before this stops recording. Eric Nadeau says, how do you choose supply? Fret wire, inlay material, wire, pots, caps. He says resistances. I'm going to leave that one. And material for the guitar itself. And how about seasoning wood and how to make sure your wood is ready for a guitar? I'll start with the wood because that's relatively straightforward. Get yourself a good moisture meter. And I'm sorry to say that by good I mean 200 or 300 quid. You can have one of those two-prong, I think I found one. I literally did just find one on the floor just now. So you can buy these two-prong ones that you stick into the end of the wood, push a button and it says, oh, 0.5%, 0.6%, but that's only at the edge of the timber. If this reads high at the edge of the timber, then yes, the rest of the timber is going to be too wet to use, really. The Wagner one, or Wagner, I'm not sure, American company, let's go with Wagner. You put it anywhere on the wood and it uses a sort of microwave to go through the wood, and it is phenomenal. And at that point, and it also is timber specific, so you put in the specific gravity of the wood, which you get from a table on the internet or included with the moisture meter. There are other brands available. There are 2 or 3 other companies that I know of that do a similar one. It's the Wagner that I know and use every day. So the most important thing with choosing wood for a guitar is whether it is dry or not. If you aren't going to spend 200 or 300 quid on a very good moisture meter, do get one of the 15 or 20 quid ones. It at least is part of the way there. And make sure you buy from a reputable supplier. Now, wood is difficult when you cut into it. Sometimes, no matter how dry it is, it will ping and move. So also give yourself time. If you're making a neck, for example, make sure that you have enough time in between cutting out the basic outline. See if it moves over a couple of days. Remove the waste, and before you carve it, leave it, if you have the luxury of time, leave it for a week or so to see if it moves and adjusts and wobbles, and you can then plane it out and go from there. Ideally, you would leave it at every single stage of carving to see what happens. Now, the same thing goes with the moisture meter. The same rule that applies to the moisture meter applies to other stuff like frets and hardware and wire, potentiometers, etc. And that is, unfortunately, you get what you pay for 9 times out of 10. And you have to find a reputable supplier. We tend to use All Parts, the UK version of All Parts, at least allparts.uk.com, I think is their website actually, it's a weird one. They have generally got very good stuff, so their fret wire I know is good fret wire. It is nickel silver, but it is harder, it's got more nickel than brass. Or more brass than nickel actually, sorry. It's good quality hard fret wire. If you are limited financially, which face it, most guitar builders are, do not, whatever you do, get cheap fret wire. And the difference between cheap fret wire and good fret wire is often, only £3 or £4, really, which in the grand scheme of things is not that much money. Don't buy cheap wood, don't buy pine, as we've just mentioned. Buy a block of sapedi, for example. Pine is actually relatively expensive. Sapedi is only a little bit more pricey than that, and we're talking in the order of £10 or so. But it will make your life so much easier having a hardwood, and I've said this on video before. So you get what you pay for, make sure you've got a reputable supplier, And do your research. Everybody and their aunt is complaining about things online now, so you will be able to find reviews for most things. Yeah, there we go. Thank you, Eric. Now, a question here from Bizman62. Ha! He says, I did the carving on a big belt sander after drawing a sideline and the curves to both ends of the still rectangular wing body pieces. The joint, although being invisible, doesn't make me feel comfortable, or didn't make me feel comfortable until I'd sawn the final shape. What he's talking about is making a hold on, let me see the other question. Through neck Les Paul Jr. type. But what he did was he jointed the wings of this through neck instrument on a big belt sander. James, all of the guitars that he built himself were jointed on the same sort of tool. And I've seen them and played them. They're really nice guitars. But the caveat is the same thing. Make sure it is a very nice, very, very, very big, high quality belt sander that you're using. I was in a workshop the other day buying a bunch of vintage tools, and the guy was selling all of his machines as well. And he had a belt sander that I desperately want. And it's not only perfectly flat and square, it's about 8 feet long with a fence that's 8 feet long. It's insane. And I don't have the many thousands of pounds he wants, but that would be useful for that. Good quality sandpaper, and if you present it properly, there is no real difference. There is a real difference. You've got a coarser joint, which arguably is not actually a bad thing. I personally think that, at least on a handmade guitar, doing it with a number 7 plane, a razor sharp number 7 plane, and getting a sort of a mirror surface on both joints will get you a better joint that's stronger. It's not absolutely necessary, and we're talking the difference between a 0.2 millimeter line and a 0.01 millimeter line, glue line. So it's up to you. If you don't mind the difference between, a couple of hundred thousandths of a millimeter, then use a belt sander. It is a verifiable tool, but make sure you have a friend who has a big industrial machine that is accurate and sharp. So there we go. A1 Bass again. A1 Bass again. He says, how do you set up a plane? I am supposed to be doing a YouTube series on setting up planes. They're coming in and out. But this is a specific question. Mine keeps getting clogged with tiny bits of wood. I never seem to be able to get the long shavings you do, even when the blade is sharp. It sounds to me, Mr. Bass, that what your problem is your cap iron. Okay, so we've got basically 2 blades here. You've got the blade that cuts, that you sharpen, and then you've got your cap iron here, which is also called that's a chip breaker. My gosh, I knew I was saying something silly. This is the cap iron. Chip breaker. And that is, I think, what your problem is. If you're using a vintage plane, which chances are you are, because most people do, if the section of the chip breaker that touches onto your plane blade is not flat and is not actually pushed down onto the blade, then it's not going to work properly, and that's where you're going to get some clogging. So, see, I've pulled one out with a hock blade on, which is actually a bad example. Here we go. Ooh. I didn't realize I had this. That's a lovely old Stanley Sweetheart number 4 I'd completely forgotten about. Okay, so Stanley's, running out of time. The chip breaker has this sort of curve in it, and there's a flat space at the top of the chip breaker. First of all, get a hammer with a highly polished face to it, and if this is got a wave in it and is a little bit bent, you can put it down on a hard piece of wood or a piece of metal or something, and carefully use a hammer to get it as flat as you can. And then you need to sharpen this edge, i.e. flatten it on a stone the same way you would a blade. And what you want is to have no gap between the bottom of the chip breaker and the flat face of your blade. And when we tighten this down with the bolt, it pushes that down, and that will stop any wood clogging up. The next thing to know is that your cap iron has to be, for best results, specifically for fine results, within a millimeter of the edge of the blade. I generally go at about 3/4 of a millimeter, I would say. And if that is tight and flat, I'm going to do a full-on video on this actually for YouTube. In fact, I'm going to try and film that today. So there we go. Doing this without close-ups and editing, that is the answer. If you're interested in watching me do the whole thing again, I am going to do that with close-ups and examples in a minute for our YouTube channel, because it is a very, very good question. So let's put that down and move on to... Okay, I'm going to do this very quickly. Sean O'Donnell says, I would be curious about Crimson's tool manufacturing processes. No. There's some stuff that we will talk about potentially, but that is the tools in the school are where Crimson really, it's how we pay the wages really. Making guitars is never particularly profitable. I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad tidings. So yeah, that's sort of, it's the one bit of information we really don't like giving out. And he says it's understandable if it's not something you want to cover. Anyway, thoughts on a good bandsaw for a very small workshop. I am going to be covering that in the next video, which will be going live within a day of this one. So I'll be covering small bandsaws and small workshops and setting up a workshop, but you can't really go wrong with Record. I have the Record BS250, which is I think almost their smallest one, and it needed a little bit of setup. It is a cheap bandsaw, and I had a little bit of an issue where I needed to tighten the table a little bit, but once I'd done that and figured out what the issues were, and it was just the one problem, it's an absolutely perfect bandsaw, and I love it. So there we go. And finally, have you ever tried a router sled for thicknessing? Yes, I have. I love it. We now have an 18-inch, a 440 millimeter wide planer thicknesser, which I love and adore. Before that, I only had 12 inches, and with one-piece bodies and one-piece tops and things, I used to have to use a router sled. In fact, we used a CNC machine and manually guided it over in order to flatten it at times. But essentially, a router sled is two bits of wood. You put your router on a big plank of wood that rests on top of those two, and then you just go backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards and use that to thickness stuff. As long as you're holding the piece down properly, it is a totally valid way of removing a lot of material fast. You don't want to plane down that much material by hand if you can avoid it. So there we go. And it was almost perfect. I have done all the questions. Please give us more below. I'm running low on topics. We will be back next week, but don't forget to come back probably tomorrow for another standalone video. Again, it's just going to be me talking, but I'm going to be talking about setting up a small guitar building workshop, the sort of tools that I would suggest for that, and how I would go about that process. So thanks for watching, and thank you again for your support. I really do appreciate it. I'm going to go and play with this plane I forgot I had. I love my life.